For many years, Mrs. Miller was the heart of that house. She wasn't just the mother, she was the foundation. She woke up before the sun rose, even when she no longer needed to work. She prepared coffee, as if her children were still kids late for school. She kept the house organized as if every corner held a memory that couldn't be forgotten. A widow for nearly 10 years, she learned to survive the silence. She raised Mark and Sarah practically alone. She sewed for others, spent nights making adjustments to dresses she would never wear, and sold jewelry she received at her wedding to pay for her son's college. She never let them feel the weight. She carried the weight alone. Over time, the children grew up. They got married. They built their own routines. The house that was once full of laughter became a transition point. They were still there, but they weren't really present anymore. And then came the small falls. First a trip on the rug. Then a slip in the bathroom. Nothing serious. Nothing alarming. But the doctor was direct. She needs more care now. The sentence echoed more than it should have. More care meant more time, more attention, more responsibility. And it was there, in that office with white walls, that something changed, not abruptly, but silently. On the way home, Mark was too quiet. Sarah sighed more than usual. Neither said it out loud, but both thought the same thing. How are we going to handle this? Mrs. Miller was in the back seat looking out the window, watching the people on the street as if she were already saying goodbye to something. She noticed the silence. She always noticed. The problem was never the illness. It was what it began to represent. And no one in that house was prepared to admit it. In the first days after the appointment, nothing seemed different. But everything was. Mark started coming home later from work. He said it was meetings, new projects, pressure at the office. Sarah started taking the children to her mother-in-law's house more often. It's better for them, she justified. In practice, it was less time inside that house, less time dealing with the slowness. Because Mrs. Miller didn't walk like before. It took her a few more seconds to get up from the sofa. She needed questions repeated. Sometimes she forgot where she had put the glasses that were on her own head. Small things. Too small to justify impatience, but big enough to cause discomfort. The first clear sign came on an ordinary night. Mrs. Miller took a long time to come out of the bathroom. Mark knocked on the door, his voice already heavy with irritation. "Mom, is everything okay in there?" She replied that it was. She was just feeling a bit dizzy. When she came out, leaning against the wall, Sarah avoided her mother's gaze. Instead of asking if she was better, she asked, "Did you take your medicine right?" It wasn't concern. It was exhaustion in disguise. The following week, whispered conversations began in the kitchen. Whenever Mrs. Miller approached, the subject changed. "We need to think of alternatives," Mark said one night. "I know. But how are we going to pay for a caregiver?" Sarah replied. "And a nursing home?" The silence that followed was louder than any answer. In her room, lying down, Mrs. Miller looked at the ceiling. The walls were thin, words crossed concrete with cruel ease. She heard every syllable. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stayed still, because what hurt the most wasn't the possibility of leaving. It was realizing that, for the first time in her life, she was being discussed as a problem to be solved. And something inside her began to change. Something no one noticed. After that night, Mrs. Miller started paying attention to details. The way Mark sighed when she asked for help reaching something in the cupboard. The way Sarah looked at her watch while she told old stories that had already been repeated so many times. The smiles became short. The hugs, quick. The conversations, too objective. She realized they didn't ask how she was anymore. They only asked if she had taken her medicine. It wasn't care. It was control. On a quiet afternoon, while the grandchildren played in the living room, Mrs. Miller tried to participate in the conversation. She started talking about their father, about how he used to hum while fixing things around the house. Mark interrupted without patience. "Mom, you've already told that." The silence that followed was heavy. She smiled, like someone apologizing for existing. That night, she sat at the dark table. There alone, she allowed herself to feel. It wasn't fear of illness, it wasn't fear of age. It was the fear of becoming invisible. The next day, a new conversation happened. This time more direct. "I can't take it anymore," said Sarah, thinking her mother was sleeping. "I'm tired too," Mark replied. "We need to resolve this soon." Resolve, as if she were an overdue bill, a leak, a structural problem. Mrs. Miller wasn't sleeping, and it was at that moment that something inside her broke for good. She didn't make a scene. She didn't argue. She didn't confront. She just made a silent decision, and silent decisions tend to be the most definitive. The morning after that conversation, Mrs. Miller woke up before everyone else. She sat on the bed for a few minutes, looking at the room she had occupied for years, the photos on the wall, the nightstand with old marks, the closet that still held clothes from the time she needed to go out every day to work. She ran her hand over the bedspread slowly, like someone saying goodbye without wanting to admit it. In the kitchen, she prepared coffee, as she always did. Mark walked in hurriedly, hardly looking up from his phone. Sarah grabbed her purse, organized the children's backpacks. Everything normal. Too normal. "Mom, I might be late today," Mark said, already near the door. She just nodded. "It's okay, son." He didn't notice the different tone, nor the lingering look. When the house became empty, silence occupied every space. Mrs. Miller walked slowly through the living room, touching the furniture as if she were recording every detail in her memory. She stopped in front of the shelf where the old photos were. She picked up a frame with an image of the three of them years ago. Mark still a teenager, Sarah with braids in her hair, she in the middle, smiling with pride. Back then, she was necessary. She put the photo back in its place. She went to the bedroom and opened the closet. She chose a simple outfit, nothing flashy, nothing to draw attention. She carefully folded a few pieces, but then put them back. She would take almost nothing. She didn't want them to notice immediately. She sat at the small desk near the window. She took a sheet of paper. Her hand trembled slightly, but it wasn't weakness. It was a decision. It took a few minutes before she started writing. Every word needed to be thought out. Because for the first time in her life, she was doing something for herself, and not for them. Mrs. Miller finished the letter calmly. She folded the paper twice. She placed it on the nightstand next to the morning medicine she wouldn't take. She looked at the room one last time. She took a deep breath, and she left. No suitcase, no big bag, just a small plastic bag and her documents tucked inside a discreet envelope. She closed the door slowly, being careful so the noise wouldn't echo through the hallway. She went down the stairs with the same slowness as always, but that day, it wasn't weakness, it was control. Outside, the morning sun illuminated the street as if it were an ordinary day. Neighbors swept sidewalks. A car passed slowly. Nothing indicated that something irreversible was happening. She walked to the corner. She didn't look back. Hours later, Sarah returned home to fetch a document she had forgotten. She entered talking loudly as she always did. "Mom?" Silence. The television was off, the chair near the window empty, the room too tidy, tidier than it ever was. A chill ran down her spine. "Mom?" She went to the bedroom. The air seemed heavier in there. On the nightstand, the folded paper. Sarah felt her stomach freeze even before opening it. She recognized the handwriting. "I heard you. I don't want to be a burden. Don't worry. Now you are free." The sheet fell from her hands. The world seemed to tilt. When Mark arrived minutes later, he found his sister pale, motionless, holding the paper as if it were something too fragile to exist. And in that instant, both understood that something had happened, something they couldn't simply resolve, but they still didn't know that the worst part wasn't the disappearance. It was what would come next. Mark read the letter in silence. Once, twice, 3 times, as if in some reread the words would change. "Now you are free." The phrase echoed cruelly. She can't have gone far, Sarah murmured, already grabbing her phone with trembling hands. They called the hospital. Nothing. They called neighbors. No one saw her. The street cameras only showed Mrs. Miller walking slowly to the corner. After that, she went out of range. She disappeared. The police were called. Questions began. Had she ever spoken about leaving? Did she show signs of depression? Any recent family conflict? Mark and Sarah exchanged a quick look. Neither answered immediately, because for the first time, they were forced to hear out loud what they had always tried to keep in whispers: family conflict. That night, the house seemed bigger. The silence was different. It was no longer routine. It was absence. The chair near the window remained empty, her room intact, the medicines still on the nightstand. Sarah went into the room and sat on the bed. She ran her hand over the bedspread as her mother had done that morning, without knowing it, and then she saw something she hadn't noticed before. The closet was almost full. The clothes were all there. She hadn't left to start another life. She had left to disappear. The reality hit hard. It wasn't an impulsive act. It wasn't anger. It was a decision. And that made everything scarier. Mark sat in the dark living room, staring at the empty space where his mother used to be. For the first time in a long time, he missed the sound of her voice repeating old stories. And he realized that the annoyance he felt before was too small compared to the void. But regret was not yet the worst feeling. The worst would come when they discovered something they never imagined. The search continued for days. Posters were spread around the neighborhood. Photos were published on social media. Message groups shared the image of Mrs. Miller with the caption, "Missing." Cruel irony. The same mother who had been treated as a weight was now called our greatest treasure. But no answer came. On the fourth night without news, Sarah decided to organize some documents in her mother's room. She needed to hand over any useful information to the police. That was when she found a blue folder at the back of the drawer. Inside, there were bank statements, receipts, transfers, monthly. Sarah frowned. Her mother had been regularly sending money to an institution called Casa Aurora. The amount wasn't high, but it was constant for almost 2 years. Mark, did you know about this? He took the papers, confused. No. In the corner of the envelope, there was a folded flyer. A shelter for the elderly. Small. Simple. A few towns away. Sarah's breath became short. She wasn't just thinking about leaving. She had been preparing herself. In silence. While they discussed resolving the problem, she was acting. Mrs. Miller was already organizing her own disappearance. And there was more. At the bottom of the folder, a contract, a waiting list, a filled-out registration, her signature, dated 3 months ago. 3 months. Which meant, when the whispered conversations in the kitchen began, she heard sooner than they imagined, and she decided not to confront them. She decided to leave before being officially discarded. Mark felt something tighten in his chest. It wasn't just guilt. It was shame. Because deep down, he knew he never imagined his mother would have the courage to leave alone. He always saw her as fragile, dependent. But maybe she was just tired of waiting for someone to choose to stay. And at that moment, for the first time, a question arose that no one wanted to answer. What if she doesn't want to be found? Mark didn't wait for dawn. The next morning, he took the car and drove to the town indicated on the flyer. Sarah went along in silence. Neither had the courage to say what they were thinking. What if she's there? What if she doesn't want to see us? Casa Aurora was on a quiet street, surrounded by old trees. The building was simple but well kept. Nothing luxurious, nothing cold. It was welcoming. As they entered, they were greeted by a woman. "Can we help you?" Mark held his mother's photo tightly. "Our mother. She might be here." The woman looked at the image carefully. She recognized it immediately, but she hesitated before answering. That second of hesitation was enough to confirm everything. "She is here," she finally said. "She arrived 3 days ago." Sarah felt her legs weaken. "Can we see her?" The woman took a deep breath. "She asked that if you came. I should first ask if you really want to talk, or if you only came because of guilt." The sentence fell like a direct blow, because that was exactly what was moving them. Guilt. They were led to an internal garden, wooden benches, a few ladies chatting under the morning sun, and there was Mrs. Miller, sitting under a tree, listening to another elderly lady tell a story. She was smiling. A light smile, a smile they hadn't seen in months. She didn't look fragile. She didn't look lost. She looked at peace. When she saw them, the smile didn't disappear, but it changed. It became more contained, more distant. Mark took a step forward. "Mom." She stood up slowly. No rush, no anger. "You came." It wasn't a surprise. It was a statement. And in that moment, it was clear that the disappearance was never a cry for help. It was a choice. But the conversation that followed would decide if there was still something to rebuild. The silence between the three of them seemed heavier than any accusation. Mark tried to speak first, but his voice failed. Sarah held her own hands as if she needed to stop herself from trembling. "Mom, why did you do this?" she finally asked. Mrs. Miller didn't answer immediately. She looked around. The garden, the light wind rustling the leaves above them. "Because I heard you." Simple as that. No shouting, no drama. "I never wanted to be a burden in your lives," she continued. "I spent my whole life trying to make everything easier. I didn't want to start making things difficult now." Mark swallowed hard. "We never wanted you to feel that way." She looked at him with a calmness that hurt. "But I did. And sometimes, son, what we feel is stronger than what the other person says." Sarah started to cry. "We were tired. It was a lot." "I know," Mrs. Miller interrupted gently. "And that was precisely why I decided to leave. You were tired of me, and I was tired of noticing it." The sentence hung in the air. "Here, no one sees me as a problem," she continued. "I help in the kitchen. I talk to the other ladies. I have a routine. I have space. I am not a whispered subject." Mark felt the weight of his own conscience crush any argument, because for the first time, he realized that the mistake was never in thinking of solutions. It was in not including his mother in them. It was deciding about her life, as if she no longer had a voice. "Are you coming home?" Sarah asked. Mrs. Miller looked at the building behind her, then at her children, and the answer didn't come immediately. Mrs. Miller took a deep breath before answering. There was no anger in her eyes. There was lucidity. "I didn't leave home because I stopped loving you," she said calmly. "I left because I started feeling invisible inside it." The words were direct, no accusation, no attack, and perhaps that's why they hurt even more. "Here, I am Helena. I am not the house's problem. I am not the month's worry. I am not the kitchen topic." Mark wiped his face, trying to contain his own collapse. "We messed up," he admitted, for the first time without defense. "But we can fix it." She shook her head slowly. "Not everything needs to be fixed. Some things need to be understood." The wind blew through the garden. Silence settled between them again, but now it was different. It was a silence of exposed truth. "I don't want you to visit me out of guilt," she continued. "I want you to visit me because you want to be with me, because you remember who I am, not what I became to you." Sarah cried without trying to hide it. "Are you going to stay here?" Mrs. Miller looked around once more, the ladies talking, the soft morning light, the sense of belonging. Then she turned her eyes back to her children. "I will stay where I feel respected." The answer wasn't a rejection, it was a boundary. That afternoon, Mark and Sarah returned home, and it was then they realized something they hadn't understood before. They were never afraid. They were afraid of the work it took to care for her. Now the house was organized, silent, light, but empty. The chair near the window was still there. Only this time it wasn't an annoyance. It was a reminder. Because in the end, Mrs. Miller didn't disappear. She simply withdrew from the place where she ceased to be seen. And sometimes what we call abandonment is just someone choosing not to accept being treated as a burden. Sometimes we think abandonment is when someone leaves, but it's almost never like that. Sometimes abandonment starts much earlier. It starts when a presence becomes an annoyance, when patience wanes, when love stops being shown. Mrs. Miller didn't disappear. She just chose not to stay where she no longer felt seen. And perhaps the most difficult question in this story isn't, was she right to leave? But rather, how many times have we turned someone who raised us into a burden? If this story made you reflect, comment below. Would you have left? Or would you have stayed waiting to be chosen again? Stories like this aren't just reports. They are silent warnings. If you like real, intense stories full of deep reflections, subscribe to the channel now. Here, every story brings a truth that many people prefer not to see. Leave your like so more people find this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear this message. And turn on notifications. Because the next story might not be about disappearing, but it might speak of something happening inside your own home. See you in the next report.